Central African Time, still tuned in to News and Views of myself, Salailo Makudir, and welcome back. We're going to be heading to our next conversation, one that I think is dominating the headlines right now. I don't think there's a few issues that divide South Africans quite like immigration. It's a topic that, as I mentioned, is dominating the political debate, whether it's on social media and even everyday conversations. There are many people that believe migrants are placing pressure on jobs, on healthcare, housing, and general public services. But there's a new report from the Institute for Security Studies which challenges some of those assumptions. It argues that immigrants contribute around 9% of South Africa's GDP, suggesting they play a greater role in the economy than many people realize. So yeah, we're going to be having that conversation. Are migrants being maybe unfairly blamed for problems rooted elsewhere, or does the economic contribution overlook the real pressures communities experience on the ground? Because I think that's a conversation that we also can't completely ignore. And we're going to be trying to answer some of those questions, and joining us to help us unpack that report and I think its implications in the discourse is Professor Alex van der Heever, Adjunct Professor and Chair of Social Security Systems Administration and Management Studies at the Wits School. School of Governance, and he's joining us via a virtual platform. And I'm not sure if you can hear me, Doc. Good morning.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Is that?
Yes, I can.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much for joining us. Good morning.
Good morning.
I want us to begin with the headline here, the report from the ISS, which says immigrants contribute around 9% of South Africa's GDP. Can you maybe just unpack that for us? How was that figure calculated, and how confident can South Africans be in its accuracy?
So I'm not sure how they calculated it specifically, but it's entirely plausible, and it's probably an undercount. The fact of the matter is that many immigrants to South Africa are very productive. They don't really have strong safety nets in place, which means that they have to set up businesses and operate in order to survive. And many have been very successful. And there are a lot of even some research that is being done in the city of Johannesburg, where it is shown that that in fact it supports an export market. The kind of retail and bulk, sort of low-cost retail market that has been set up there, in particular by Ethiopians, but it's all across many of the cities. Immigrants have been actually contributing to the economy, and they are not harmful in any way to the economy. So the issue really, and I think to make this clear, is that in many countries, the issue of immigrants and foreigners is used as a political stratagem, particularly when political parties actually have nothing to offer. So they target a vulnerable group that can't really fight back. It's easy to abuse. And I've also heard that in many cases you hear of basically brutal thuggery against these foreigners, where people basically steal their possessions, etc., on the basis that they are foreign. It's utterly lawless, but it is used as a political stratagem as we move toward elections. And you'll find it in Europe, you find it in the United States and other countries, that this is basically a tactic of in particular right-wing political parties that try and sow division as a way of marketing their political parties. And I think that we have to be very wary of this kind of strategy, because it is incredibly damaging to the social fabric. And we also have to understand that in many cases, our undocumented foreigners that are in South Africa are related to the fact that typically our sort of home affairs arrangements have not been working very well. The home affairs officers have been corrupt, they've been deficient, and it's very difficult for people to get properly documented. So to be so-called lawful in South Africa has been prevented by our own public institutions. And so I think that what we have to be looking at in the region is that we have to say, well, how do we deal with the movement of people in between countries and between rural and urban areas? And we have to find ways of making that safe and accommodate it and making it contribute to economic growth and development. So countries that have large populations are incredibly successful. It contributes to economic growth. But you attack those populations, you attack people moving into cities, you destroy the fabric of your economy. And if it basically is we're handing our society over to thugs who are going to steal the work and the sort of sweat of other people as a convenient consequence of a political stratagem that is no better than the apartheid stratagem of Swart Gevaar in the past, which is the same thing. Attack somebody who can't fight back. Attack the Jews in Germany. These are all the same strategies. They're very effective. They're very seductive. And they can make people worry about things that otherwise they wouldn't worry about, and actually have no real meaning for them in their lives, day-to-day lives. What matters to people are jobs. What matters is a safe society. And if we have coherent policies in our society, we will have all of those things. But if we give into this kind of political division, we will have none of those things. We won't have a safe society. So, but we also have to understand that Africa and South Africa have cities where there is a continuous movement of people from rural areas into urban spaces. This trend is going to continue for at least the next sort of 10 to 15 years, in which if your country and your city is very poor at managing that movement, this isn't keeping people out. This is managing the movement so that the movement into cities and their accommodation is safe, secure, and productive. That's what you do when you manage cities. So that this trend is going to continue, and part of this movement, even across the border, is about moving from rural areas to urban areas. It is entirely to our benefit if done right. But if this is our approach, we are in a hiding to nothing. We are destroying our society and our economy for the sake of short-term political gain and shabby politics that really is beneath our values in this country.
I want to stay with, the obvious question that critics might ask, looking at this report, the fact that if migrants contribute so much economically, then why do so many South Africans feel like they're competing with foreigners when it comes to jobs and some of those business opportunities that you mentioned in the beginning?
They're not competing for them. In many cases, what you have is you typically in economics will refer to emergent economies where people basically are creating new jobs and businesses. There's no zero-sum game at all. That is an utterly ridiculous argument that is used. Nobody's taking the position that you would have had. In many cases, the kind of work that is being created in many cases by immigrants and people newly coming into cities is jobs they're creating themselves. There aren't positions in the formal economy that they're automatically moving into. So as part of generating new businesses and new arrangements, they're actually stimulating an expansion of the economic base. So there's no zero-sum game. This is nonsense. If it was a zero-sum game, the United States, when it was originally created, had 13 million people. How do you think it got to nearly 400 million? Mostly immigrants. Didn't destroy the economy of the United States. China has, well over 1 billion population. If population harmed economic growth, China would be a declining economy. But no, it is second only to the United States. So, and India is growing at 7% per annum with a massive population, and its internal movements are not being managed. People move from rural areas to city areas where they want to go in India. They're not confined and constrained. Same in China, same in the United States. And in the European Union, when they created full mobility of population, it contributed to the economic development of Europe. So everybody talks about economic integration as a strategy, which means you look at regional economies, not tiny little artificial borders that we've created that actually harm economic growth and development. Let people go where they're going to create work or enter the economy. But this idea that people are taking other people's jobs is a lie. It is an absolute lie. There is no evidence of it. There is no empirical backing for such nonsense. It is just a stratagem used to get people to think that somehow, to get them angry over something that they can't see or understand without having this artificial grievance constructed for them.
Another aspect, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here, if you can just indulge me, is the fact that, while migrants do contribute to the country's GDP, it's still municipalities and local governments that still have to carry the cost of providing healthcare, for instance, education, policing, and just general services. And the report does not adequately account for those fiscal pressures. How do you respond to that?
So firstly, let's look at where our public facilities are not working. It has nothing to do with migrants. It's got to do with corruption, and it's got to do with the poor leadership that we have in many cities. So if we had to look at Johannesburg as an example, where we've got a consortium of parties that are supposedly leading the city, you have what is being sustained irregular expenditure for over 10 years in that city. You have the systems for revenue collection have been failing. So they don't collect revenue, and that undermines their ability to spend. And when they spend, it is corrupt expenditure in many cases. Compare that, say, to the Western Cape, which faces the same kind of migration issues, internal migration, which is the biggest factor that impacts on cities like Johannesburg, Ekurhuleni, and Cape Town. Cape Town's not static. Johannesburg is not static. But Cape Town's population is now overtaking that of Johannesburg. But it is not failing from a revenue perspective. It is able to budget billions in infrastructure spending and expand while we have this internal movement of people, predominantly from the Eastern Cape, because that's the closest large rural population, and the city that they're migrating to is a successful city. And they have the lowest unemployment rate. They have the highest economic growth rate in the country, and the city is completely solvent and expanding. Johannesburg, by way of contrast, with at this point in time an identical population, also facing internal movements from Limpopo, from Mpumalanga, from KZN, and yet it seems unable to cope. Now, its inability to cope is not because of that movement of population. It is principally because you've got a city that is incapable of managing itself. And that's why we have a constitution that says change the government if they can't perform. And we should do that. But the issue is to blame migrants as a way of scapegoating your own incompetence and corruption. I think we do have to realize that many of our municipalities are failing because of corrupt administrations and conflicts of interest all the way through those structures that have been permitted and not followed up for many years. And it's so easy then to say, oh, well, it's migrants doing this. This is utter nonsense. So we have enough money in this country to accommodate the population we have. And when migrants contribute to economic growth and development, whether they're internally moving, in other words, moving from a rural to an urban area or moving from another country to South Africa, they contribute to our economic growth and resilience. And it actually creates the revenue for our public services. So we can expand with that population growth, as it has in China, the United States, in India. You expand with it. It's not harmful. So the only question is really, do we have governments, when we talk about municipalities and provinces, that are on top of their game? Or are they basically just failing because private interests are driving what people do in those leadership positions, and then they just find a way of creating a sort of a toxic political campaign in order to stay in power when they haven't actually been able to contribute anything themselves, and the only people who should be removed is them.
And excuse me, I'm not an economist, but I have a little bit of understanding of what GDP is. And another question which may arise from this report is the argument that maybe GDP is maybe the wrong measure because economic growth doesn't necessarily translate into better living standards for citizens. Is GDP alone enough to make the case for immigration?
No, typically GDP is an indicator of changes in economic performance overall. It is not necessarily an indicator of improvements in well-being, which is why people supplement or other indicators and figures together with a GDP indicator. that a GDP indicator is an indication of economic performance, because depending on how you estimate it, whether it's on sort of transactions, sort of inputs or outputs, you've got a figure that can give you a sense of the size of your economy and how it's changing. Now, in South Africa, if that figure shows that we are declining on a per capita basis, even if you're not capturing all of the social variables that are important, it's probably not good. And if it is increasing on a per capita basis, it's probably good, but it is not sufficient for improvements in economic well-being. So typically for well-being to be improved, you have to look at the effectiveness of the expenditure and the structuring of the delivery of public goods and services as well. Those support the expansion of well-being, the quality of the schools, the quality of the social protection regimes that are in place, which are redistributive and make economic growth inclusive. So migrants are not responsible for the inclusiveness of economic growth. Governments are, typically. They are the primary responsible party for ensuring that we have a reasonable degree of counterweight to pure economic activity as your method of distributing well-being. It's not sufficient. You do need governments. But if governments fail, then you don't have that. And I'm afraid this is what we have to focus on in South Africa, is where governments are failing to perform, our redistributive systems are not working. It doesn't help that we have a big taxation system that transfers enormous amounts of money from higher income people, and that expenditure is stolen and basically rediverted back to a corrupt elite. Then what you have is increasing levels of inequality and failure, and basically a decline in well-being despite any economic growth that we have. So we do have to make sure that our public services work at the end of the day, because the money that's coming in is currently going to the wrong people, and we have to accept that we've got to change that. And therefore we have to put government under the microscope and make them function and stop them from basically trying to change the conversation to something else.
Oh, they have it. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Professor Alex van der Heever, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you giving us your time, and I think for unpacking. I'm pretty sure it was going to be a very, very conversational report from the ISS. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And with that, we're going to take a quick break. News and views will continue right after this.